Okay, I think it's 12:20. Why don't we start? Yeah, if you came here and you were hoping to find Scott here, my apologies. That must be disappointing. But I think, when is Scott on? Is he on next week or?
No, I don't think so. I think he gets a bye. Well, no, I will have to talk to Scott.
Okay. So anyway, Scott and I, we just swapped spots or shifted them around a little bit. So it's me today. Sorry. But he'll be back. And before I prepared a little something about documentation, which I think is close to the hearts of many people. But before I go there, since this is an HDF clinic, just a question is, does anyone have any questions about HDF5 or HDF in general? Anybody?
Nope, Gerd. I'm ready to go.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, okay. I have only one screen and I can't see the Zoom application at the same time. Okay, so the topic that I chose, and hopefully we'll have more detailed announcements soon, was to talk about documentation. And this is not so much about the history, which is pretty long, but it's about where we are going with documentation and sort of the sad state of affairs we are. And I'm going to try to give my explanation or spin on how we got here in the first place. And but then definitely the most important thing is I want to give everybody an idea of where we are going with documentation. And I condensed this all in one cartoon here, or one slide. And it starts in the upper left-hand corner and ends in the upper right-hand corner. And so my earliest recollection of HDF documentation sort of starts with plain HTML that nowadays would look a little dated, but hey, nothing wrong with plain HTML. And in fact, when I joined the HDF group in 2010, in late 2010, we had actually 2 dedicated staff members working on documentation. And so to me, that's sort of the golden age, the eternal bliss. Okay, so this was 2010, HDF5 was going full steam ahead. And of course, you have to see this on the background that there was HDF4, obviously, was in production and being used, and HDF4, of course, had its documentation. And my understanding is that at the time that was still managed widely in FrameMaker, for example. So there were FrameMaker files, and then I used a FrameMaker in a different job before that, around the same time. And yes, FrameMaker had export capability to export web pages and so forth. But yeah, we'll come back to that type of workflow in a moment. But it was sort of, yeah, the golden age, plain HTML, love it or loathe it. It's nevertheless, and of course the iterations that the HTML standard has undergone, still plain HTML is not too bad. But then of course, yeah, with the whole arrival of style sheets and JavaScript and so forth, yeah, things maybe got a little out of hand. Anyway, so the HDF group, as new technologies started emerging, and I'm going to go around this circle, and this is not a complete list. We tried many more of the ones listed here, and you'll find artifacts here and there that just show how experimental this whole thing was. But there was a fundamental problem. But on the surface, what this led to was this, so I can't only compare to this maelstrom experience where you try all kinds of things, nothing really sticks, And certain things are good for some things, but not so great for other things. The depth and breadth sometimes of commitment that you make into these tools can be quite substantial. And it's not only the generation of the documentation itself, but then you have to think about, well, I want this documentation in printable form, ideally, but also I want to host it online. So does it have specific hosting requirements? Does it require frameworks? How rapid is the development cycle and so forth? And in particular, how easy or how difficult is it for maintainers of the documentation, but then especially for community projects, how easy or how difficult is it for community members to participate in the creation and refinement and maintenance of this documentation? And but in a way, our documentation even today is far from being perfect. But if there was one seminal moment that sort of, I think, was a crucial insight, not just for us, but I think for anybody who works on documentation for a project such as the HDF5 library or something like that, is it is really it is important to make sure that you treat your documents like code. And this is actually not quite like this, but similar to this, the cover of a book by Anne Gentle. And that is a nice book that basically talks about the ramifications of the benefits of if you treat your documentation like code, or the other way around, if you don't do this, how easily things get off the rails and go haywire. And she also has this, I repeated that over here on the left, and I think this is definitely characteristic for the early days of HDF5 documentation. Specifically, I can't speak to HDF4 because I wasn't around, but definitely in some developer quarters, there is a little bit of disdain for documentation, or documentation is someone else's job. And the people who do documentation, they are kind of second-class citizens and so forth. So that's an attitude problem and so forth. And that's bad enough, but it's even worse if your developers are in a way separated, or if the workflow by which you produce and maintain documentation is sort of alien or unusual for your developers. And this docs-like code type workflow and methodology, and this is really more of a methodology than a specific technology, because there are many different technical frameworks that you can use to implement this methodology, and we have adopted one, and I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. But that was sort of the a seminal moment for I think for us, but also for everybody who's working in a similar project with a similar code base and so forth. Unless you treat your documents like code, you will never produce very good documentation, and that especially if your product is aimed at developers rather than users, that's particularly difficult. And it's not just developers in the case of HDF5, it's maintainers, it's integrators, it's power users, it's end users in some cases. So that the needs that they have for documentation is sort of a great variety. Anyway, so but then of course, as part of this sort of investigating all these different things, there are certainly some technologies that stand out, sort of traditional, what you see is what you get type approaches, where that leads to what I would liken or compare to plastic pollution, which is that the perfect example are our RFCs, where counter to sort of the perhaps esteem of developers, they used Word, and yeah, Word was easy. And the problem with many of these easy to use technologies, they have a tremendous effect of quickly producing stuff. But the quality of the stuff that you can produce quickly is typically not that good. And yeah, so we have our fair share of, in our own backyard, of sort of plastic pollution type documentation, our RFCs being the prime examples. And but it will take longer to sort of more change that, bring that on a more sustainable base, as with real plastic pollution in the environment. Anyway, so what's the path forward, or what are a few incarnations before I talk about the future? What are the incarnations? Well, most of you have probably seen the support portal, which is still available online, support.hdfgroup.org. And I think I have that open somewhere. This is what it looks like. It's still out there at support.hdfgroup.org. And you can look at HDF5, you can look at documentation, and you will see some of that good old plain HTML documentation, although now I have to dig. If I go to unsupported prior releases, I think I can quickly find something. Yeah, here's some good old plain HTML, and this is what it looked like. And no, is it the prettiest in the world? No, it's not, but it's certainly highly functional. And the content in terms of the explanations and so forth is actually not that bad. And many people, because our current documentation is in just such a sad state, a lot of people refer back to this documentation because it's not glitzy or pretty. But it's certainly informative, and yeah, typically the quality of documentation is not judged by its glitziness. Then we have, just to show what kind of proliferation and to a degree, I'm not going to use the word pollution, but the proliferation that really has taken place is, okay, there's this other thing called Portal, which is sort of like a gateway. From here, you can get to our support site, you can learn something about consulting services, go to downloads, and go to documentation, and for the different products and so forth. And that's nice, and there's probably a place for that. But then why is it called portal.hdfgroup.org? Why do we have support and portal, and then we have docs.hdfgroup.org with different versions, and then there are different versions, although oftentimes if you use something like Doxygen, for example, there are many capabilities to indicate which version of a product a particular function or API or struct or whatever applies to. And so having multiple copies of this is not only redundant, it's quite counterproductive, because if you look at it from a search engine perspective, then since Google and other search engines will index these different sites that have a lot of duplicate content, because not all reference manual pages, for example, change from one version to the next, then these search engines have trouble understanding, well, which of these copies is the preferred or authoritative copy. And so that confuses them. And typically these search engines, unless they find information about an authoritative copy, they just don't index it, and which means that if you do a Google search, you won't find the right page in none of these versions. And so that's not good. So what's the path forward? Well, the path forward is to go in a way back to where we came from, in the sense that we want to unify documentation as part of support, downloads are part of support, our help desk is part of support. So instead of having this proliferation of DNS namespace inflation, we will go back to organizing or routing or basing all our support offers on this site, support.hdfgroup.org. And in the case of documentation, it will be support.hdfgroup.org documentation. For downloads, it will be support.hdfgroup.org downloads. And then after that, the product of the name, and if versioning information is required for the respective versions and so forth. And so that's where we are going. And specifically for the documentation, there is a very interesting project on GitHub. So we are using already for the reference manual and some of our other documentation pieces, Doxygen, which is out of the box not the prettiest, but it's certainly functional, because as far as embedding documentation and marking down or marking up documentation in source code using Doxygen is actually it's easy to learn and pretty straightforward to maintain. And my colleague Alexander discovered this project called Doxygen Awesome, which in a way takes the, for some tastes perhaps, retro-looking Doxygen style sheets and gives them sort of a modern appearance, more along the lines of Read the Docs or Sphinx or things that people might know from the Python ecosystem. And I can give you a quick preview of this. This is actually pretty far along. I just created a pull request where we pretty much, we had to clean up a few static HTML files, the table structure and so forth. You can look at the PR if you want. But basically, it requires just adding these style sheets to a code base, to an existing code base, and then, yeah. And so I can give you a quick preview of this. However, I have to quickly restart. Yeah, my, obviously I'm using code spaces here, and after a few minutes of inactivity, these code spaces tend to go to sleep. So I got to quickly launch that again, and then I can show you in the browser what this will look like. And it in terms of the workflow, generating this documentation, it will be no change from the existing way. So whether you use CMake or whether you use CMake or AutoTools, it doesn't really matter. And so this is the same kind of Doxygen documentation that you see here, just with a few updates. This is what the styling will look like. So if I browse around here, you can see this is what's going to look like if I jump, for example, to the reference manual. And that takes a moment to load. I don't know. Might be the connection speed, because yeah, I'm running this in a GitHub code space. So if I go to H5S, for example, and then it just, yeah, it looks a little more pleasing and stylish along the lines of Read the Docs and so forth. And so, yeah, looks pretty. The RCs are still here, which you can download. Most of them are PDFs. But then, yeah, we spent a little bit of time also polishing some of these specifications so that the HTML, the static HTML, renders properly and things like that. And so that's what's coming. And where did my slide go? Here. So yeah, stay tuned. Our goal is to have this pretty much in place. I mean, bits and pieces as far as the downloads go and so forth, that is already in place. Our goal is to have this around the HUG conference, which is going to be in early August, I believe, 5th to the 7th, Lori, is that right?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So if you haven't registered yet, go register, join us. It's going to be great in Chicago this year. HUG 2024. And so yeah, by that time, we hope we have this rolled out and then sort of talk about it at the event itself. And just one more thing, that was a little too recent, but yesterday, if you follow the forum, breaking news, the author of Pure HDF actually released his version 1 that I covered in a previous episode, was in beta, but he actually released version 1 and he released version 2, the difference being the type of .NET framework, since the .NET framework and C#, of course, develop alongside. And so he released 2 versions, version 1, which is sort of compatible with some of the older .NET frameworks, and then version 2, which is sort of looking to the future and sort of the roadmap forward for .NET. I'll cover that next time, whenever the next time is. I forgot if I always get the chance when there are 5 Tuesdays in a month. But then, hey, someone might be willing to swap with me. But stay tuned for that. Yeah, I will prepare a Pure HDF release review for one of these future clinics. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say for today. Any questions, impressions, comments? I mean, anybody who's dealing with documentation, what do you think? It's a difficult problem, certainly. I think there's no disagreement about that. Anybody? No? Any other questions about documentation, but also HDF in general?
I can just tie up some loose ends. Gerd, your next session will be July 30th, so coming up reasonably soon. And then the URL for the HUG event, August 5th through 7th, is hdfgroup.org/hug/hug24. And there's the link to register on there. And if you're watching the video recording later on, it'll be in the description of the video.
Great. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Anything else? Yep. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.